Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Social Housing Roundtable on, well, it's certainly snowy here. I don't know where it is, what it's like where you guys are. Brian just said in the chat there, it's snowing there too. So good morning. Very glad to see the roads are clear, but apart from that, we're good. Yeah, just wanted to welcome everybody. This is the Social Housing Roundtable. If you are new to it, a massive welcome. I think this is about 150 something episodes we've done now, so lovely to see so many people with us already. And my name's Matt Baird, so I've been running this for about 4 years. The idea when we first set it up was to get people talking during the pandemic to share ideas about best practice. And it's grown into this incredible community of people. We've got over 1,500 people on the mailing list. We've had nearly 2,000 people attend this year, and we're continuing to grow and grow. And I think we've already booked about 40 of the sessions for next year, which is absolutely incredible. So thank you so much to everyone who's joined and who's with us today. A bit about me, I'm obviously the founder of this, but I'm also co-chair of the board for Spring Housing in Birmingham, a supported housing charity that works across Birmingham and the West Midlands. And I'm also the one of the co-founders of the Supported Exempt Accommodation Forum. Day to day, I work in recruitment. So I've been recruiting in social housing for 13 years. I've worked with some of the people in this room today, either helping them secure roles or indeed helping them find staff. So that work keeps this going for free. So if you are ever looking for recruitment support, do please reach out. I promise I try and do it a bit differently to the main agencies out there, and I'm sure I can get some people to verify for me in that space as well. So on to today. As most of you know, this year's roundtable is sponsored by Alertacall, but today's session is sponsored very much by Bridge Housing Solutions. So Jess and I have known each other for a little while. We've worked together on sharing best practice and sharing ideas on a few different forums, and just said, hey, look, we've got some stuff we'd love to share about what we're doing. Can we bring it to the roundtable? It's very much, we want to talk less and share more. So get everybody in the platform talking more. So, well, absolutely, this is what we're all about. So I'm going to pass across to Jess to introduce herself, introduce today's topic and session. If you are new, please feel free over the first kind of 10-15 minutes of Jess's presentation to put thoughts, ideas, just general kind of downloads into the chat box, and that stuff can all get brought in. From there, we will then open it up to a more open discussion where everybody will be welcome to come and share ideas and best practice. So without further ado, Jess, over to you.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Thank you for giving up some of your time to come and hear me talk for only about 10 minutes, because actually I'm hoping that what we'll get out of this is a really good discussion. Right, I'm not a Zoom person, so let me just get this shared and see if you can see my screen. There, can you all see it?
Just loading now, and we're in.
Fabulous. So the title of today's session was The Ethics of Allocating Social Housing to Create Mixed Communities. And what I mean by that is, oh, has something happened? Has it moved? Oh, hang on, how do you move it on? There we go, it's all right, there we go. So this is my challenge that I'm laying down really to people today, is that I want to be convinced, so convince me that the benefits of mixed communities outweighs the moral dilemma of housing people who don't need social housing in social housing when there's a huge need in temporary accommodation. And what I mean by that is there's quite a lot of housing associations all over the country who are using Rightmove to let properties, and I think it's morally a bit tricky when there's so many people in temporary accommodation. So there's a few things that we're going to have a look at today that I'm hoping is going to get us into a good discussion. So I'm going to talk a little bit to mixed community benefits. I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenge of priority need legislation and what that means in terms of needs of tenants coming through into social housing. We're going to have a look at whether mixed communities are really beneficial, a little bit about internal stigma and temporary accommodation. Sounds a lot, it's going to take me 14 minutes, I timed it. Yeah, let's go. So who am I and why should you care about anything I say anyway? I am Jess Page. I started my housing career in temporary housing in Newham, which is in East London. It is constantly listed in at least the top 5 most deprived areas in the country. I loved it. Best job I ever had, temporary housing officer in Newham. Loved it, loved it, loved it. So I've got experience in temporary housing, then did some work around welfare reform and tenancy support.
Yeah, no, that's
someone's talking. And then I got my last sort of 5 years, I was director of ops at Women's Pioneer Housing, and I saw my boss's name on the screen, Tracy Downey, and I was all right till I saw her name, and then I got nervous because, you know, you've got to do well in front of your old boss, haven't you? And Women's Pioneer does have a public waiting list, so I'm happy for someone to take me to task on my hypocritical views from today. I'm happy to have a chat about that as well. And currently I'm a statutory director and the strategy director at Bridge Housing Solutions. So just a quick bit on what Bridge is. That little picture on the right of your screen there is Nick Fahy, who is our lovely founder and one of the best people I've ever met. She worked at RBKC and she wants to take a national look at homelessness. So what we do is we work with local authorities to match families in temporary accommodation with permanent social housing out of borough. And we do it because we take time to understand people and their preferences. This is not this is your one offer. You are forced to move to the other end of the country. You might live in London. You've got a sister who lives in Essex. And there's nobody in the local authority who can sit and do that level of matching. But we can, when housing associations tell us they've got a void that they need letting, we can match people to them. So that's what we do. Right, let's talk about mixed communities then. So mixed communities, I think we all inherently believe that there is a benefit to a mixed community. And I'd like to put off the bat, I'm not against them. I'm against letting on Rightmove, but let's just have a look at this. So we think that they're more equitable. We think that they remove socioeconomic disadvantage, increase tolerance. There's actually very little evidence that mixed communities have an inherent benefit to us as people unless tenure is mixed. If you mix tenure, you start to see some benefits around neighbourhoods being more popular and there being higher resident satisfaction. If you just sort of pop people in to social housing here and there, it's not giving you the same benefit of a mixed community unless the tenure is mixed. And throughout all studies, measures on individual outcomes are much harder to obtain. And there's a really great study that looked at an employment support programme in London. And they were really hyper-local and they were looking very specifically at a community that had low employment rates. And the programme itself was massively successful. Loads of people got into employment and they did, it wasn't just your basic, you know, here's something basic, entry level, get you a job. You know, they really worked with people to maximise their income earning potential. They did loads of work, but the area didn't improve. And what happened was all the people who got like the really good jobs moved out to somewhere else. So separating people in place is really, really difficult. It's hard to work out which is the thing that's making a difference. Now, I accept in the sector that there is a challenge to some extent in priority need legislation. So by nature, the individuals coming from local authorities may have got a vulnerability in some sense, because that's what priority need legislation is. But we also have to remember that priority need immediately categorises as families with children is eligible for social housing. So actually, a lot of our new tenants coming in could just be families who've got a lower income. And we're making this sort of assumption that a tenant who's coming from the local authority is going to have more of a vulnerability. So let's put this one on Rightmove for a little mixed community benefit, you know. But even if the incoming tenant is more vulnerable, I would argue that social housing is much better placed to help and support and manage that housing than the private rented sector, who can just Section 21 and do whatever they want to get people to leave. So does where you live make a difference? This is my favourite research study of all time because I'm a total geek like that. This is called Moving to Opportunity, and it was run in the early 90s in the US. And what they did was they moved families from high poverty areas to low poverty areas. So people who lived in an area where there was 40% poverty or more, they moved them to areas where there was 20% poverty or less. And the way they did it, they had three groups. So in America, you get this thing, or you did in the 90s, called the Section 8 voucher. And it's like a voucher you can use to spend on housing. So one group were given the voucher and could choose wherever they wanted to move to. One group were given the voucher and could only spend it in an area where poverty was less than 20% of the population. And then there was a control group that stayed in the same place. And they also filtered out so that the only people eligible for the programme didn't have rent arrears and they didn't have any criminal convictions. So you're already self-selecting people who've got an additional advantage or opportunity. This study is so interesting. So in the short to medium term, boys who moved to low poverty areas actually did worse in terms of crime, specifically property crime and behavioural issues, than the boys who stayed in their neighbourhood. Adults who moved, there was no impact on their income. People didn't suddenly become wealthier because they moved to a wealthier area. And in the medium term, there were just no better outcomes for the children who moved. Now, obviously, more time has passed since the 90s, and a recent review of it said in the long term, if you move very young children from a low income area to a slightly higher income area, they will do slightly better in their own income and earning potential as adults than children who don't move. But actually, the link ended up being really tenuous, and there wasn't a lot. And there's 4,000 families in this study. It's really good. If you look up Moving to Opportunity, I think it's just such a fascinating study. In terms of where you live making a difference, we've also got agglomerate economies. So, you know, if you have services that you want and that you can afford nearby when you've got a more homogenous community. One of the things around that is about gentrification, really. So once like wealthier people start moving in, services start increasing prices, or the services change to meet the people with the biggest spending power. And also informal job search networks. So I thought this was really interesting. I studied this when I did my master's degree. About 50 to 70% of jobs are just not advertised. So they're just, you know, passing around jobs between people that you know. And even out of all jobs that are advertised and not advertised, up to 80% of jobs are filled with personal or professional connections. If you're me and your neighbour's a banker, the banker is of no use to me to get me a job. I do not want a job in banking. If your neighbours are like you and work in similar industries, and you know, you can put in a good word, you can find things. So there are benefits to that. A little note on internal stigma. I think this is really interesting. So I'm talking about, you know, as a sector, we do quite a lot of work around let's, you know, smash down the stigma of social housing. And we're quite often talking about sort of like press, media, you know, the wider community. And actually there is internal stigma within our sector. I think it can come from staff and it can come from tenants. So certainly I've worked in large employers who perhaps some of their staff are working there because it's a job rather than because of the social purpose. And I've heard them say things that are not acceptable. But also I think I've heard, you know, dozens of comments. So when I worked at Women's Pioneer, we had a public waiting list. So you had a public waiting list and you had local authority nominations and various different routes into our housing. And I found that not all, but some tenants who came in through a public waiting list would pull me to one side in a meeting and say, I'm not like the other social housing tenants. I'm, you know, just to let you know, I'm not like everybody else. I thought, well, is there some like common factor among the 3 million social housing tenants in this country that everybody shares that suddenly you don't have? Or, you know, they're so different. And I think that sometimes there is this stigma around we don't want any more council nominations. And I've heard that a lot in all different providers from tenants. So there is that internal stigma as well. And I think it's difficult. You know, it's demonstrating that mix doesn't always promote tolerance. And I think what we have to remember is, this is where I'm going to say it, because I'm going to go off on one in a minute, about how class and income is not a protected characteristic under the Equality Act. And it seems to be like the last ground that people can just willy-nilly discriminate against, you know, and we want people who are working, we want this. You just couldn't say that about any of the other protected characteristics in the Equality Act. So I think we've got to be really careful about that. Just a note on tenant choices as well. You know, social housing tenants have got the least choice out of everybody when it comes to their housing. And, you know, what we do at Bridge is we try and bring some of that choice back. And I think every home that is let outside of social housing need is just reducing that choice further. So a note on temporary housing then. we know these figures. I don't think these are going to be any of a surprise to anyone, but I'm just reiterating them. 117,500 households in temporary accommodation. That is 151,000 children living in temporary accommodation. That affects children. Children are not immune to understanding their circumstances and what is happening. 17,000 households are in B&Bs. That's 5,500 children in B&Bs. I have 2 children. They are 1 and they are 4. And if I was in a B&B for 24 hours a day with those children, I would have a breakdown. There's no privacy. There's no place to do homework if you're older children. 3,000 of those households have been there longer than the 6-week limit. And housing associations are choosing to advertise homes on Rightmove. 55 children have died since 2019, where living in temporary accommodation has been a factor in that death. So why are we using Rightmove to allocate homes? My personal view, I think that as a sector, we're doing it because we're trying to handpick a tenant who we perceive to be easier to manage. And I don't think that's appropriate when we've got all these people who are in temporary housing, who are in desperate need. I think that we've got this idea that handpicking different kinds of people, usually we're discriminating on income because it's not legally covered to avoid that. I think popping those people in is not giving us those mixed community benefits that we think we're going to get. I think it's trying to make management easier. And that's it. So talk to me, convince me otherwise, I'm open, but I think it's something that we need to talk about.
Thank you very much, Jess. And it's I don't know if you've a slide with your details on it to follow up, but I mean, I think this is definitely going to be a conversation. It's almost like I knew. I think definitely a conversation that will follow from this. I'm going to just go through some of the points in the chat. Then I'll go to Brian. I'll get a couple of thoughts from you on some of the points in the chat, and then I'll go to Brian and anyone else who'd like to come in. As Brian has done, please do raise your hand. So here we are. So one of the points that Barbara made almost early on was surely housing associations are not using Rightmove. They have lettings and voids team, and Mark said I used to work for an RP that used Rightmove as it can be used as an extra tool for advertising, especially for properties that were hard to let.
Yeah.
How common a practice is Rightmove for those who are obviously unaware? How common practice is using tools like Rightmove, Zoopla, others are obviously available, for letting social housing properties?
I think it's hard to say. I don't think we have that information. But for example, I know a very large social housing landlord, a very big one, and it's written into their allocations policy that you can download from their website. And it was a board decision around mixed communities to use Rightmove. I know other organisations who use it as a complete last resort when they've got a property that they've not been able to let through the local authority, and they've tried and they've not been able to get a transfer into it. They've put it on there because ultimately that property should be let. And I understand that, but that's where we come in. If you've got a property like that, we will have someone who will want to take it, who's living in temporary accommodation. So I think it's really hard to say what the scale is, but if one of the biggies is doing it in their policy, it must be insidious in other places.
Sue Healy has put that in North Warwickshire, the local authority has all nominations for housing associations which work in North Warwickshire, and she lives in an area of deprivation which chosen as a levelling up project to tackle inequalities. We have some wealthier properties and never get involved in the community. So having a mixed community doesn't work for those who have it all but don't want to give back. I think this is kind of what you're making in your presentation.
I think this is the thing about I do think mixing increases tolerance. And, if you were listing all the protected characteristics of the Equality Act, I think there is a benefit for people to meet people who are not like them. But the Equality Act doesn't cover income or class. And it feels like it's like the last battleground. Do you know what I mean? It seems to be like the last appropriate area or acceptable area that we think that we can sort of discriminate around. I agree that the mix between the wealthier households and the less wealthy households, it doesn't happen. It's not like you suddenly live next to someone who's got more money than you and you get more money. That's not how mixed communities work.
Barbara's mentioned in the chat, there's not much choice now when bidding for homes on Home Finder. The rules have changed. Tenants have less choice. The authority chooses who is successful for empty properties. And a bit backed up by what Kate has mentioned. Kate Willis said it's not just about priority need. 96% of people who go through the homelessness gateway have experienced trauma, either as ACES or as lived trauma as an adult. If you only place tenants out of temporary accommodation into social housing, then you place everyone who has suffered trauma in a small area. This would have an ongoing impact on blue light and crisis services.
I think Kate's nailed it, really, because this is the issue. And I think that from a housing sector point of view, that's what we're trying to prevent. Like, you know, a ton of, I know some people don't like the word vulnerability. I'm just going to use it. I'm not using it in an offensive way. You know, a ton of people with vulnerabilities all stacked up living on top of each other, and the difficulties that causes. And I understand that, and I appreciate it, and I've managed it. But if social housing doesn't house people with vulnerabilities, where are the people with vulnerabilities living? The private rented sector? How is that beneficial societally? You know, we are probably the best placed sector to take people into our housing who have got additional needs or additional experiences. Has anyone ever heard a private landlord talk about a trauma-informed approach to their service? You know, in the sector, we talk about that. And I think that it makes it difficult. It can make it difficult. Until we have enough social housing, I don't feel comfortable that we would choose somebody who's got means over somebody who hasn't.
And I think that's backed up a bit by what Danielle Hillary's put, which is instead of discriminating against people who are perceived to be difficult tenants, we should be investing in tenancy sustainment and intensive housing management to improve the chances of success for those people. Placing challenging to manage tenants in one area just leads to ghettoisation and further stigmatisation, which is certainly an interesting point within that. Brian, I'm going to bring you in because we'd love to hear from you today.
When it comes to social housing, and particularly when it comes to housing associations, there's quite a few housing associations that are operating more like private landlords rather than social housing providers. And in a lot of cases, their emphasis is on building shared ownership, building houses for private sale. When you look from a society point of view, for many, many years, when social housing was, I suppose, under the control of local authorities, you got that mixture of people who lived within an area. You tended to have them who worked, for example, where I am in Barnsley, which was a mining area. You had communities that built up around the workplace and the community, which has been lost. And when you have organizations who are using whatever agency, Rightmove or Zoopla or whatever, to let properties, that's not a social housing provider. That has gone completely outside the realms of what social housing, the meaning of social housing was. And the provision of homes for people, whether they're working or whether they have vulnerabilities, should be the priority within the organizations. But where you've got organizations who are looking at the bottom line, the accounts at the end of the year, but not looking at the people within them properties, you have lost the whole meaning of social housing.
Amen. Preach. I agree with that, Brian. Yeah, completely.
Thank you very much indeed, Barbara. I'm going to bring you in as well.
Hi, thank you. Brian, you echoed everything I was just thinking, so I'm not going to say it again. Bravo. What I would say is there's not enough monitoring from housing associations via a housing officer or feet on the ground from the housing associations, whoever they are, because I believe it starts at the lettings process, the void, the empty property. It is literally the local authority that hand over the successful bidders to the housing association. So stop saying that the social housing are the ones who are, which they are, putting the people in there, but they're not vetted, they're not checked, they're not monitored, and the backgrounds that Brian was just talking about is very relevant. And each area has its own communities. They're not monitored once they get in there. And that's causing and will continue to cause problems nationwide. Thanks, Matt.
You are very, very welcome. I'll bring Sue in just a moment. There was a point I was going to read out of Sue's, which I'll let Sue probably raise herself in just a moment. But Danielle had put, it was Danielle, sorry, it was Meg had said, I think it's also important to remember that even households in emergency and temporary accommodation in desperate need have wishes and preferences, sometimes refuse choices. Sometimes refuse accommodation if the area is not of their choice, if it's a flat without a garden instead of a house, etc. I think there is sometimes an assumption that homeless households should accept whatever is offered to them, but it's rarely that simple. And it's backed up by Daniela said, which again is about the stigma around social housing, thinking people should be grateful for what they're given, rather than being entitled to a suitable home that's fit for purpose. And Jess, I know this is something you've got a passion around as well.
Yeah, I think the thing is, if you're privately renting, or even if you're buying a house, whatever, you can go and sign that contract and be like, if this doesn't work out, I've got options. At the end of this contract, I can move. I can sell my house again. Yeah, okay, I'm going to pay a fortune in fees and stuff, but you have choices. And I think that with social housing, once you're in your home, it's really difficult to move again. Yes, we have mutual exchange platforms, but really, and transfers, but it's really difficult. So people should 100% be really fussy about what they take, because they might not ever get to move again. It's really difficult. And I think that is one of the things that we do really well at Bridge. I've worked in housing associations all my career, and I've put pressure on people when they needed to transfer. If someone's trying to escape violence, and I'm like, look, this is the best offer you're going to get. You need to take it. And here we don't do that. It's because we've not got the same responsibilities or statutory requirements, we can have really good conversations with people. What is your choice? What do you really want? What is on your list that a property has to meet? And then if that comes up, great, but we have we manage expectations. If you're going to wait in your borough for something, it might be 15 years. We've got something 45 minutes away that meets your expectations. What do you want to do? And we give people that kind of space to have the discussion. If you ever read our Google reviews, some people say, I got to move back to where I grew up, and they would never have had that opportunity in the local area. So I think that's right, that what's been said there about choice, and just being grateful for what you're given. I think there needs to be more choice.
I couldn't agree more. Sue Healy, I'm going to bring you in. This episode of the Social Housing Roundtable is sponsored by Alertacall. Alertacall helps as many people as possible feel safe, connected and informed by combining ingenious technology and award-winning human contact. Alertacall's digital engagement solution helps social landlords proactively know their customers and properties by putting a portable touchscreen in every home, offering a daily property check through the optional OK Each Day service, plus repairs reporting, tenant surveys and much more. They also provide Beyond Warden Calls, an easier, simpler and lower cost wireless warden call solution with video door entry, dispersed telecare and smoke alarms. Alertacall works with over 60 housing providers across the UK to enhance two-way engagement between customers and landlords. In 2022, Alertacall won the Queen's Award for Enterprise and Innovation, and in 2023 won Housing Supplier of the Year. I'm delighted to have them as our sponsor of the Social Housing Roundtable throughout 2024.
Well, I'm sort of a bit horrified at some of the things I've heard. So my local authority does support people that apply for housing, but that's very much driven by the tenants. In my case, I didn't even meet the criteria to move onto the waiting list because it was perceived that everyone told lies on their application. When I challenged that, by taking independent advice from Shelter, I got a site visit the next day and I was rehomed 24 hours later because my house was not fit for human habitation. So we've got, I see some of the things you're actually trying to do. It's almost, I feel like it's gerrymandering. I really do. perceiving bad tenants and only taking those that you perceive that you can manage to move. You should be supporting all tenants. So even if they've got sort of issues, our local authority, so we know young people tend to fail their tenancies because they can't manage a budget. So we actually put them on courses and that before their tenancy. We support them through their tenancy. We do lots of things like that. We very rarely have a failed tenancy in North Warwickshire. You know, it literally is, it's an oddity if we actually have somebody who fails a tenancy. I just think that it's discriminatory, what I'm hearing. I really do. Local authorities and housing providers should have better policies. That's what the regulator is saying. You should be working with your tenants to make sure that the support systems are there, listening to people that have actually been through crisis. Now I'm going to give you an example of why you sometimes get a bad tenant go into a housing association. I was a victim of antisocial behaviour. I had an horrendous time, but I knew what the policy was. If she carried on complaining, they wouldn't rehouse her to her area of choice. And I told every single resident in our street, you can't complain about it for 12 months. I will take the abuse that's coming my way, even though I was not the instigator of what she perceived had gone wrong. I knew who it was, but I kept my mouth shut. And I took the whole thing on myself. We went the 12 months and then she got rehoused. And within hours, she'd already had 6 complaints from the housing association. And the director of housing come to visit me and said, what was she like living here? And I said, well, it was your policy. I turned your policy on its head and we used it to get rid of her, because you should have had policies in there to manage that, but you didn't. So if the only way I could get rid of her was to tell everybody I will take it on the chin and have her go at me every single time I left my house for 12 months, if that's the only way I was going to get rid of her for life, well, that's what I did. And I actually tell other people, if that's why you're, and I tell people across the country, because housing providers should be providing services to support even a difficult tenant. And that's why you get difficult tenants moved to between providers, because some of us have actually worked out how to get rid of difficult tenants when your own local authority won't intervene. Sorry,
Jess,
I'm sorry, I'm talking from...
Absolutely fine. Thank you very much, Sue. Jess, any thoughts on some of that before I go to a comment in the chat and then I go to Jim?
I was just going to say it's about management, isn't it? Do you know what I mean? Like, if we're letting something on right move because we don't want somebody with a difficulty or a vulnerability coming in, well, if you're not going to manage it, if you're not going to help that person when they move in, then that's probably why you're doing it. Whereas if you're a really good landlord who's got those services set up, then you're going to manage it better. So yeah.
And as Kate's mentioned in the chat, Barbara said the mutual exchange is taking over biddings as families can't downsize or upsize. And Kate has said this expands across the whole sector, not just general needs. Working in the supported sector, it's important to make supported accommodation a part of the community, not just a property with difficult tenants. IHM should be embedded within tenancies to empower tenants who are vulnerable to manage their tenancies long term. And that sits with commissioning within the local authorities. Jim, I'm going to bring you in.
Good morning, everybody. Morning, Matt. Hi, Jess. I just think that at the point of tenancy, and James from Sora Social Housing, we have the Under One Roof scheme, and in the St Helens area, and in Liverpool, we have the Property Plus property pool. So before anybody gets any tenure, the situation is you have to go through your housing benefits office to then be allocated through one of these organisations. So it's really fait accompli by the time the actual social housing landlords get to meet the tenant, because once the properties they've bidded for it and it's been accepted, and they do have the choice, of course, of being able to swap the tenancy between themselves once they do have a tenancy, to move from there and move to a different tenancy with somebody else, an exchange on it, with agreement. But the main thing is when the tenancies come about, is the fact that what's happening is they have the therapist coming to look at the properties with the person, and they go, "Oh, that's fine for me. That meets all my vulnerability needs." And then within a matter of weeks, they're saying, "Well, actually, you know what? I could have done with a shower instead of a bath, or I could have done with this or that." So you have a situation there where it blocks it. The other thing being, of course, was the under occupancy tax, which caused a storm. You suddenly found that people who said they needed houses and flats and this, that, and the other suddenly decided, well, I'm not paying that, so I don't need that, so I want to swap tenancy. So I think when you take all that into the mix, you can kind of see where you're at. I think it's really at the very end, if a property is so difficult to let, that they'll put it through things like purple bricks or whatever it might be. So that's my view on it anyway.
Thank you, Jim.
Yeah.
Over to you. Jess, any thoughts?
Oh, sorry, is it me now? Yeah, I think allocations are difficult. And I mean, how many times have any of us moved house and realised we needed something slightly different, or, you know, but it is difficult, I think, making choices. And I think as well, when there's pressure that it might be your only offer, you know, people take things that perhaps aren't quite right. And it is a balance all the time. It's a balancing act. But yeah, I mean, listen, if you've got anything in the Northwest that you have to put on Zoopla or Rightmove, you don't need to. I'll find you somewhere.
And I think this is the thing, isn't it? It's about being able to turn around and say, actually, at the moment, there are people who are going, I just need somewhere to live that isn't temporary accommodation. And actually, when, you know, I guess it comes down to that question around how much effort is being put in to really house somebody in a property before we just put it out onto the wider market, because as you say, it's easy and we know it's coming through and we're sorted. And I think that balance between the two is what's off. Jonathan, I'm going to bring you in.
Morning all, Jonathan Graham, work at Broadacres Housing Association in North Yorkshire. So yeah, it's just an interesting topic really. Find it a little bit difficult to believe that housing associations are regularly advertising properties on Rightmove. I think, as Sue said, you know, we work in a sector that's heavily regulated. You know, tenancy standard says that landlords need to have fair and transparent allocation systems. So they shouldn't be, you know, regularly advertising properties on Rightmove to circumvent letting to difficult customers. So if they are, then surely they're going to be found out as soon as they're inspected and be told, well, you need to stop doing that. We have advertised on Rightmove, but only as a last resort where it's been extremely low demand properties. We had a few flats in a sheltered scheme we just couldn't let. We advertised them 5 or 6 times through our choice-based letting systems. We're then penalised, obviously, for having empty properties sat there. So we chose to do a Rightmove advert just to generate demand. We then go through the standard letting process to make sure that we're letting to the right people that meet our lettings criteria. So yeah, interesting one. I think on the allocating in to homeless customers, I totally agree that you want to try and put homeless customers into properties that they're going to want to live in and that are in the areas that they want. But I think if you put yourself in the shoes of the local authorities, they just don't have the properties to be able to do that. And then equally, they're being criticised for leaving people in temporary accommodation for too long. So if you've got people in temporary accommodation saying, well, I'm not going to move there and I'm not going to move there, what are the local authorities supposed to do? They have to make them an offer of something that is most suitable, which often won't meet the needs and desires of that person. But again, what are they supposed to do? I think the simple problem is we just don't have enough properties nationwide to put everyone in. So, you know, authorities and housing associations are doing the best they can with what they've got. So yeah, it is a tricky problem, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, look, type in any of your favourite housing associations into Rightmove and see what they're advertising. People are doing it systematically. Jonathan, we'd love to work with Broadacres. I could fill your sheltered units very quickly. We do a lot of sheltered housing. Sheltered housing just seems really difficult to let. Like, everybody who I speak to has always got something knocking about that they just can't seem to let. And yeah, we feel quite a lot, to be fair.
And I think it's about also realising the problem and the challenge there that Jonathan raised, isn't it? Which is that sometimes you do get a stage of going, you only have a finite amount of resource, a finite amount of homes, a finite amount of everything. And it's great that a business like Bridge are there, but I think so long it's just been, we just need to get somebody in and someone living in here, because otherwise we're losing money, we're losing funding, we're spending more money trying to get it filled and everything else that goes with it. And there is a time where I guess you go out to market and say, actually we need someone living in this because we need it from a sustainability, from our own financial sustainability side. And is that a conversation you're hearing, Jess, just before I bring in Lisa? Is that something you're hearing from clients that you're working with?
Oh yeah, completely. And I mean, you know, as a former director of ops, you know, if something's trundling along and the local authority can't find you and it's taken ages to go through each round of nomination, you know, you have your boss get it let. It's normally me actually saying get it let. And I know I keep plugging bridge and I don't want it to be like a sales pitch because that's not the point of this, but we find tenants in 5 days. We have so many people on our lists taking that national view. That's how it works. And I can't believe that more people don't work with bridge. You know, I worked with them at Women's Pioneer because it was good for those ones that I couldn't let some sheltered flats for love nor money. Bridge always had somebody. And I think sometimes we're not creative enough in terms of how we might work with other organisations. But I completely sympathise with why people, as an exception of hard-to-let properties, put them on Rightmove. If it's written into your policy, I think it's wrong. And, you know, like Jonathan says, I do hope the regulator picks it up.
Thank you very much. Lisa, I'm going to bring you in.
Hi there. Just really, it was more about when you talk about the vulnerabilities and you know, obviously the complexities of these families that need to be moving in. And you know, I work within neighbourhoods now, and you know, we do everything we can to physically support those people when they move into our properties. But I think we have to look at it more holistically. And actually, the differences from the different housing associations I've worked with over the years is, you know, different local authorities work slightly differently, and actually the wraparound support can be very different. And actually, then we are left with the complexities to manage ourselves sometimes, to a degree. And we do what we can as the best we can. But actually, you know, it might not be enough to try and, you know, for sustainability purposes. And the last thing we want is obviously for tenancies to not be sustainability, that we will always do everything we can. So I think we just need to think about the bigger picture there as well, holistically. Thank you.
Couldn't agree more. No, absolutely couldn't agree more. And I think it's, you know, I mean, going to some of the points that have been raised in the chat. You know, Julie said tenants have oversight on RPs, but they would mostly not know why Rightmove letting is wrong. And I'm aware that the concept of using Rightmove is sold to involve tenants. I think someone's loud in the background. Just going to mute there. As doing the right thing by advertising more fairly to a wider audience. Sue had said, when we have occasionally had it hard to let, our local authority has advertised allowing a wider criteria, so we find a tenant and that has worked. And I guess a couple of questions that have come through for you then, Jess. One from Shonax asking, how was BHS funded? And a question from Barbara, which areas are most likely to be affected?
I don't know if I'm allowed to reveal our business model of how we're funded. The local authority makes a saving from temporary accommodation, so that's where our funding comes from. So which areas are most likely to be affected? Geographical, I assume this means. Yeah, I can see Barbara nodding.
I think generally, as you mentioned before, like sheltered housing is a big one. So, but
yeah,
I think
yeah.
Also specific areas.
I mean, look, this is anecdotal. I don't have the research, but anecdotally, it varies. So I think there are some areas which are hard to let. So, for example, a provider who I'm not going to name, who I've been talking to recently, have got a handful of properties that are just slightly out of their usual operating area. Slightly more rural, and they're really struggling to let those because their usual methods aren't quite working. It's like a borough boundary, it's just slightly off, and their existing tenants don't want to transfer there, so they've just like got a little tricky bit of stock. Small flats, I mean, I used to manage stock in Kensington and Chelsea, and some of them were very small and I couldn't let the small ones. They were really difficult. I often use Bridge for those. So I don't know, it's anecdotal. I haven't got anything statistical around that.
Fair enough. Wayne, I'm going to bring you in just because we've not heard from you yet. Jim, I'll come to you in a moment, but Wayne, I'll come to you first.
How are you, Matt? You okay? Yeah, so Jess, just a quick one. So I've been involved in supported housing for like 9.5 years. For far too long, we feel that obviously people have been ill-placed, misplaced. So when you're looking at progressions, potentially is it the fault of the resident? Half of the time, no, it's a fault of the person making the referral. Or the placement. So obviously when you're looking at doing your placements or your referrals, And what sort of tenant engagement or tenant involvement do the residents have when searching for themselves?
Okay, good question. Full disclosure, supported housing is not my area of expertise. Matt might be able to give more on that. So what kind of control is it, the question about a resident, what kind of control a prospective tenant has over where they can choose to go? Is that the question, Wayne?
Yeah, so even in temporary accommodation, so obviously you're explaining obviously that certain providers obviously are struggling to let their accommodation. So how is it that so say I'm a resident, also I need temporary accommodation. How are you then doing the placement into an area where the housing association is already struggling?
Yeah, okay. So I think the way that the local authority will place you anywhere in temporary accommodation, and I think you pretty much have to accept it, is my understanding. What we do at Bridge is, where you are in your temporary accommodation, we will ring you because the local authority has told us where you are and that you're there, and we'll have a conversation about what you want. So because we're not a statutory service, we don't have to make one offer and you're cut off forever. You know, we can spend that time where we say, what do you want? What do you need? Which areas are you willing to live in? So some people will say, I'll go an hour and a half away from where I am. Some people will say half an hour. And then when something comes up in that band, then we can have a conversation, say, this is it, this is the street, look on Google Street View, what do you think? And have more of those nuanced conversations that I think local authorities would love to have, but they can't. A, because they don't have access to the properties in that way, and B, because they don't have the time or the resources to do it. So the way that we do it at Bridge is much more flexible and a bit more human, I think. Is that the question? As I answered that?
Yeah, pretty much. So is it the housing providers, the housing associations come to yourselves, or do you get the leads and then approach the housing associations?
A bit of both, really. If I hear something on the grapevine that someone's struggling with voids, I'm going to ring them. But what we want are people to partner with, who we can have long-term good relationships with. So some organised housing associations we work with give us one void a month because it's just something that crops up. Some people give us an awful lot every week. And it just depends really on what they have and what they need to get let through us, and we're here to support them, really.
Thanks very much, Jess. Yes, Jim, do come in.
Hi, Matt. I'm just saying here now, looking at this, isn't this basically what the for-profit landlords are doing, where they're taking up slack from housing association tenancies that can't be read, difficult tenancies, properties that are allocated that they can't allocate, and then you get the for-profit organisations coming in and taking those over. And in doing so, again, creating a glut within the system instead of retrofitting, they tend to be just taken over and leased for a number of months or whatever. Is that not part of the problem? And also, as I said, when they're being actually allocated, the fact of the health professionals coming around and not taking into consideration the vulnerabilities and the healthcare of the person moving into whatever the accommodation is, not assessing it properly, and then the housing associations have that glut within them because they're blocked with that, within that position.
The thing on the leases, that's not what we do. We're literally a bridge. All we do is connect the tenant to the property. The property at no point comes into lease with us, and the tenant at no point is our tenant. We're a connection service, if you like. We're the bridge, if that answers that. And health needs of people, I think, is really, really important, really important. And we had someone the other day who was talking about, we were talking about the number of stairs that there are to the flat. It was only a small number of stairs, and the tenant was really keen and really wanted to take the property. I suspect because they're in temporary accommodation, they've got a long way. But the conversation that we had that is ongoing, that property is not going to work, it's not going to be suitable. So we wouldn't ever be like, right, you have to take it now because we've had that call. We don't need to, because we have so many people who that property would be suitable for otherwise. And we do a lot of work with people around their health needs. I hear the team talking about it all the time, making sure that they're understanding medical conditions and what that means for housing.
Thank you, Jess. Barbara, I'm going to bring you in. Hopefully. Oh, we've lost your video. See if we can get you unmuted.
Good.
There
Right,
we are.
am I here? I have no idea what I've pressed. I'm so sorry.
Don't worry at all.
I'm absolutely committed to what you're saying, Jess. It's brilliant, and all of the questions that are coming up. And just before James, the previous person, he sort of like asked you the relevant question. It opened it all up about what you do and where you go. Have you got any responsibility after you have worked with the authorities to put, just say me, in a property? What happens if I'm a failed tenant after I've signed up? Do you have any kind of links with the housing association afterwards?
I mean, we pay the first 4 week rent up front. So we do that for every tenant so that every tenant can just get a good start. So you get your first month paid and then you can just settle in and get your furniture and whatever else you need, because I know not everyone does furnished tenancies. We check in with people in that period after they've moved in to check that they're all right, how they're getting on, everything's been all right. But after that, you become a tenant of the new housing association. So if there are issues there, we don't really have the power or the jurisdiction to intervene. That's not really where we are. We're more linking over the lettings, but we do try and get people off to a good start with that first bit of rent.
Okay, and where do you predominantly access these people who want to be housed? Are they homeless?
They live in temporary accommodation. Some people are roughly,
they're in temporary,
but it's basically we've got tens of thousands of names basically of people who are living in temporary accommodation across various local authorities that we work with around the country. And then when properties come up, we work through those lists to match people to that property. So,
and you can literally take somebody from Middlesbrough to London,
yes,
and London to Middlesbrough.
And we do, but only if that person wants to go. We're not forcing, it's not a one-off deal. It's only if somebody feels like that's the right thing for them to do. But yeah, occasionally some people will be willing or want to move that far. Usually people don't want to move that far.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you, Jess.
Thank you, Barbara. A question which come up that I was going to kind of raise as well, as we move into kind of last few minutes, really. I did say to you, Jess, the hour would absolutely fly by. Question from Shonak, which was, how do people in temporary accommodation access or find out about BHS? And I think it ties in a bit as well that I wanted to ask, which was that trust for you to step in and say, hey, look, you know, we know someone in temporary accommodation, we're going to go place you with a housing provider. There's sometimes, as has developed, a disconnect between potential tenants and housing providers, between those who have been on the waiting list and actually securing homes. People who don't trust registered providers in general, or maybe don't trust a specific one, and you can turn around and go, well, we've got you somewhere, yeah, but I don't want to be with them. How are you working in that space? Because I think this, you know, the point there around Shonak saying, how do people in temporary accommodation access or find out about you? It's not finding out, it's how do you build trust with them? And I'm just interested in that piece, really.
Yeah. So if you're in temporary accommodation, you need to find out if your local authority works with us, because obviously we have staff to pay, so we have to be paid by the local authority for the service that we're providing. So on our website, we should have a list of all the local authorities that we work with. You can just ring us, and we will tell you, we'll say which local authorities, and we'll work out. And if we don't work with your local authority, tell them about us. You know, we'll work with anybody. We want to do as much help as we can, especially now it's getting colder and people living in horrible temporary accommodation. In terms of trust and those conversations, I hear people having them all the time. You know, and you can hear them in the office, where you're talking about, you know, their family, their kids, what their needs and wants are. Our recruitment is brilliant. We have massive diversity in our staff team. We have people from all walks of life, and we have people who can talk to and relate to the person who they're speaking to. So lots of people who've got their own housing experiences work for us, people who've experienced homelessness, all sorts. And I think that helps, because it doesn't feel like a them and us thing. You know, it's just all of us. We're all just people. We all have housing. We all need housing. Everyone's got a different housing situation, and I think that's how we do it. And we're not bound by that statutory regulation of who's next and what offer is it going to be. We're more nuanced, and there's ethics around that, don't get me wrong, about how you're matching people who might not be at the top of the list, and I understand that, but sometimes you have to have a bit of nuance to get an outcome, and that's what we do.
And how do you, so you then calling round temporary accommodation places and housing providers to go, hey, look, this is what we're offering? Or how do, because you've said that you've had some incredibly powerful conversations with people living in temporary accommodation. Yes. How does that conversation start?
Good question. Oh gosh, you're asking me a lot of operational detail for a strategy director, Matt. The local authority who we work with, we have a data sharing agreement, and they would send us the people who are living in temporary accommodation. We would have some understanding of what those people's needs are, and we would just start ringing. So like we might ring 10 people in a row who say, absolutely not, I want to stay, in one of these 3 postcodes in my local area. And that's a very London thing that happens in London a lot. But that's fine. They're going to have to wait for their local authority to match them. But anybody who's got some flexibility, that's when we start getting them on our books, getting them through the matching and seeing what comes through.
Thank you very much. Yes, question from Wayne. I think probably be one of the last ones of the session. Wayne, over to you.
So I'm just to understand a bit more. So obviously people that are in temporary accommodation. So you've got a housing association which has got residents in. You have a housing association obviously that's got voids. So then you'd actually contact the resident of a different housing association where the resident already is to potentially do the move. Is that where you're potentially...
So a housing association will ring us and say, hi, I've got a void, I've not been able to let it. It's a 2-bedroom house in Ealing. And then we would be having a look at the people who are living in temporary accommodation, who are waiting for permanent social housing, who needs a 2-bed, who's put this area down as their choice, and we'd start working through trying to see who wants to go and view that property. So we're only contacting people who are in temporary housing, who are waiting for permanent social housing. And we don't really work with private rented sector. It's about getting people out of temporary housing into their permanent social home.
Danielle, I'm going to bring you in. We're moving into the last minute. Sorry, Wayne, I know you probably had a follow-up. I've got to try and fly through and get everybody heard. Danielle, over to you.
Yeah, I think mine's probably a point from a little bit earlier on, but I just think we, as housing associations, need to get better and learn from the private sector a little bit around advertising properties to the same standard that we would do on Rightmove when we're advertising on Home Finder, because actually what we're doing is asking somebody with no pictures, no accurate floor plan, there's a 2-bedroom house somewhere in Bedford or within a postcode area in Northampton, do you want it or not? Well, how am I meant to make a decision on that? How are you meant to? And then the expectation is you turn up on the day, and that might be the first time you ever see it. Sign it, do you want it or not? And if you don't want it, then potentially this is an intentionally homeless decision, you're going to lose your... And I just think we need to be giving people, it's a capacity issue in some ways, like we need to be giving people the information that they need to be able to make an informed decision, instead of just plunging blind into one of the most fundamental life-changing decisions that they're ever going to make with no information, and then they're committed to that choice potentially indefinitely, or it's very difficult to get out of. We're dealing with people that have already been through immense trauma, that feel like they're not empowered, they've had things done to them. And I think sometimes as an industry, we're just re-traumatizing people. I don't have a solution other than that we need to just up our game essentially and have a strategy that treats people with more dignity.
I agree.
Brilliant. I mean, fantastic, wonderful. And if you're working with Home Finder, come work with us. We pay the rent up front, they don't.
And I mean, just I think as a final point from Danielle, that's a hell of a point to end on, and kind of just thinking that it's about going, we can and should be doing better than this. And if we were trying to buy a home or move home ourselves, we wouldn't accept that. So why do we expect it from social housing providers, when we're looking at social housing? The topic of today's session was the ethics of allocating social housing to create mixed communities. Jess, in the last 30 seconds, I'd love your thoughts on the session that we've just shared, but also just in terms of next steps and what you would like to see change.
Yeah, I love this. Thank you so much. I think we've had a session full of enormously passionate people who really blooming care about social housing and what we're doing here. If you are an organisation who uses Rightmove, or you've got hard to lets, or you're using one of those, just drop me a line, jess@bridgehousingsolutions.co.uk. Also on the slides, there's the business development email. Get in touch, because, you know, we want people out of temporary accommodation into their permanent social homes, and you want your voids filling. And there's a really good ethical way of doing this when social housing is such a scarce resource, and that is what we're set up to do. So it'd be really lovely to work with more people to feel like we're doing the right thing.
Thank you so much. Judging by the comments in the chat and everything that's gone off today, it's clear that it's been a really popular session, and I hope anyone catching up on the recordings will also find this really useful. So thank you very much, Jess. Next week, we are doing 2 episodes kind of the Social Housing Roundtable in one. So on Tuesday, we've got the CIH joining us to discuss 16 days of action regarding domestic abuse. And then on Friday, we are doing a social value learning group roundup of the work that they've done and some of the award winners and things. So that's going to be on Friday at 11 a.m. But more details on those tomorrow. For now, just a massive thank you to Jess, for Alertacall for sponsoring this year's sessions, but to Bridge Housing for sponsoring today, because it's been a really great session. And I look forward to catching up with you all at another session sometime soon. But cheers, and thanks very much again, Jess.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.